doch wie auf dem Stuhl mit.
Welcome. It's a wonderful group. Let me welcome you to Starr Auditorium. You have passed the test and found the room. That's in itself says a great deal about this audience, about which, so you'd better be careful about what you say to them. This is a smart group. Before we begin, let me say a few words about the organizations that brought our speaker, David Tupuri, here with us this evening. The one sponsor is the International Student Committee, the ISC, which opened an office here at Harvard last year through the support of Harvard undergraduate Allison Hughes. I didn't know Allison very well before this evening, but I've just nominated her to be president of the university when Neil Rudenstein retires, whether voluntarily or involuntarily. It strikes me as a good idea. The ISC organizes the International Management Symposium held at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. I always want to say St. Gallen. She tells me, no, wrong place, St. Gallen, right? So that was the first held. Included in this group of 9 Harvard students who will be participating in the 23rd annual symposium will be 3 Kennedy School students. So we've gotten involved in that piece of the business. Other sponsors, the Kennedy School's Institute of Politics, which is intended to be the connection between the world of politics and Harvard undergraduates at Harvard University, is a co-sponsor of this event through its Student Advisory Committee, along with the newly formed Harvard St. Gallen International Business Club, which are also sponsoring this event. In this time of changing political alignments, we're all bound together, as we've come to learn, by a global economy and by the world of international trade. Acronyms like GATT and like Nafta and EFTA and EEA and the EC have come to dominate discussions not only within universities and governments, but even on television and in the public dialogue. And a few people actually know what those acronyms stand for and mean, even though they've become such a dominant part of our discussions as we look at the challenges and the opportunities of this new focus on an international economy and international trade. Tonight's speaker has devoted his career to addressing these issues: trade, diplomacy, industry, and the economy. David Tupuri presently serves as chairman of the board of BBC Brown Boveri, the Swiss half of the Swedish-Swiss electrical engineering conglomerate, and of ABB Asia Brown Boveri, of which he is co-chairman. According to The Economist magazine, and I don't know how accurate this is the 9th largest of multinational corporations. And I suppose it depends on what dimensions they measured would determine the accuracy of it. With an already strong presence in Western Europe, the firm is expanding rapidly in Eastern and Central Europe and in Asia. Mr. Tupuri serves on the boards of directors of a number of major companies, but his expertise goes far beyond the world of business and industry and engineering. From 1970 to 1988, he held various diplomatic positions in Washington, in Brussels, at The Hague, and in Bern. He also did a great deal of work and coordinated Oxfam's work in Africa. From 1988 to 1991, he held the rank of ambassador and served as Swiss delegate for trade agreements. It was during this time that he served as chief negotiator for Switzerland in the Uruguay round of GATT. As chairman of the OECD Trade Committee, and, in addition, in the same time period, as the Swiss governor of the Inter-American Development Bank. And I thought I was busy. This makes me look rather lazy. He continues to be an active advocate of free trade and an informed and respected voice on international economic issues. Arthur Dunkel, the general director for the GATT, has called Mr. DeBury and his family, quote, citizens of the world. I was intrigued to learn that Mr. DeBury has described Americans as, quote, liberated Europeans, quote, quote. We, the liberated, are eager to hear from him tonight. I hope you all will join me in welcoming David DeBury.
Dean Carnesale, dear friends, thank you so much for inviting me here tonight. It's a great honor for me to speak in front of this School of Government, this Kennedy School of Government, which is really today at the center of power, as we've just discussed, because just about all its faculty is now running this country, and what is left is here. And I think that it is really terrific. I was in Washington these last 2-3 days to try to find out what this administration was about. And I think here tonight is the place where I'm going to find out, because I did not quite find out in Washington. Thank you also to Alison Hughes, the future president of this university, as we have heard, for inviting me. She is, as you know, the link between St. Gallen and Harvard. And let me tell you, St. Gallen is a terrific business school. It's, in fact, I think the only one in Switzerland who is worth anything. Secondly, it's a school which is a very disciplined school and which organizes a symposium once a year, organized by the students, and it's a dialogue with business people and government people. And I've been there many times. I've given speeches there, and it's a terrific experience because it's the only symposium. You know, we all get invited to symposia, to lots of them, and once in a while we go, but St. Gallen is the most exciting of all. I mean, Davos is nothing next to it, let me tell you, because, again, St. Gallen is organized by the students, and I very much believe that the only thing which counts are the students, because they are going to be the people who run our countries and our businesses tomorrow, and that's really what counts. And what we do with you people is what counts, and this is why I'm delighted that there are so many students here. I'm a little bit intimidated by the fact that there are also some professors here. They're the only people left in this world who intimidate me. I don't know, maybe it's because I wasn't a very good student, but I hope that what I will say will not disappoint them as well. I have talked to professors, in fact, today, and but the speech I have prepared, I wrote it before I came to Washington and Harvard, and I'm a little bit confused after having talked to several professors like Lester Thoreau and so on, but I will stick to the speech I have prepared because I think I still believe what I had prepared before I came here. Now, what I want to talk to you about is trade, in the widest sense of the word. And I want to talk to you. Yes, I forgot one person I wanted to mention here is the mayor of Baden, who sits all the way back there. Baden is the little town in Switzerland where Brown Bavaria is located. And you see, he doesn't leave me alone. He follows me across the Atlantic. He wants to be absolutely sure that what I say here is in conformity with the Baden spirit. Thank you for being here. And I also want to mention Professor Euterhoven, who is also sitting somewhere here, who is member of my board and professor at the Harvard Business School. So you see, we have good people in our boards. We have professors in our boards who keep us on a straight line. I'm going to talk about trade, and I'm going to talk about it as a former trade negotiator converted to businessman. And it's maybe not going to sound very academic, but it's sort of my experience. I'm first going to tell you what trade and the trading system means for a company like ABB. Then I'm going to tell you about trade as an engine of growth. Then I will talk to you about the sad state of the trading system in the world and why we should try to fix it. Then, if I have time, and I'm going to try not to be too long, I'm going to talk to you about what the trade agenda is for the future mainly ecology, energy, and technology, and then make a few concluding remarks. Now, ABB and the World Trading System, the Dean mentioned this article in The Economist 10 days ago, and we are ranked number 9, and this article ranks the 50 largest multinationals in the world according to their foreign assets, and they were number 9. And among the top 50, among those 50 companies, only 5 companies have a higher percentage of foreign sales than ABB. We have over 85% of sales outside of our home countries, which is Switzerland and Sweden. Only 5 companies have a higher percentage of sales outside of their home countries. In fact, what this article is trying to convey is the fact that most multinational companies are not as multinational as they pretend to be, because for most multinational companies in the world, the home market is still the main market. This is not the case for ABB. As I said, 85 to 90% of our sales are outside of our home countries. More than 80% of our people, we have about 215,000 people working for ABB worldwide, work outside of our home countries, 30,000 of them in this country. We have 25,000 people in Central Europe, in Poland, in the Czech Republic, in Hungary. We have 40,000 in Germany, and the rest all over the world, some of them in Sweden and Switzerland, the home countries. ABB is a company which is organized in such a manner as to take maximum advantage of a world economy which is in a state of integration. This means that our customers' needs are being satisfied locally, because customers' needs are always local, but with resources which only a global company producing, researching, marketing, financing all over the world is able to provide. In other words, we are a company which is organizing itself along a system which is still emerging and which may begin to take shape in 5 or 10 years. And this society is a society which has been described by many people, including some here like Lester Thoreau, Bob Reich, and others, in which more and more goods, in fact most goods nowadays, are produced, researched, marketed, financed through multinational processes, and less products are produced nationally. Agricultural products are still produced in one country. People are another factor of production which doesn't move much, but most products and services are going through these multilateral processes. And in this kind of world, the one who will win, be it a country or a company, is the one who will compete in many places, in fact, everywhere. If you want to be competitive in Europe today, you have to be competitive in Japan, in Brazil. A machine producer in Switzerland was recently telling me that if the day he would sell his first machine in Korea, he would know that he is competitive in Europe. That's very much what we believe at ABB. So for us, the world integration, which has been described by so many people, by so many professors, has to continue. In order for us to satisfy our customers, and among them are many governments, industries, transportation companies, and many other economic agents, we need borders to be more open, and this not just for products, but also for services, for people, for technological know-how, and so on, for capital, for information, and so on. So we need a modern trading system, more than you would believe, and if this trading system, if this world integration system doesn't emerge, well, we will not die. We will continue to produce everywhere in the world. In fact, many people say that multinational corporations exist because world integration doesn't happen as it should, and in order to be present everywhere and to take advantage of all places, even though the borders are not open. In fact, that is true. But if the world integration doesn't progress, we will still be there, but the cost of what we do, the quality of what we do, will be much less good. Maybe also the technologies will be less sophisticated than if this system emerges. Now, if you listen to that, and I'm now going to talk about trade as an engine of growth, if ABB is for free trade, you would think that most other multinational companies would be for free trade as well. Because after all, a multinational corporation by definition is a corporation which produces and sells more than in one country and thus depends on a functioning trading system. If they all felt like we felt, well, I'm sure that these companies would be a formidable force for this integration, for this new trading system. I'm told, and this I also read in this article, that in 1970 there were 7,000 corporations in the world which qualified as multinational. Today apparently there are 37,000 with 170,000 foreign affiliates in the world. So if all these corporations thought like us, this would be a formidable force for growth and for free trade. But the fact, though, is that this is not the case, is that many multinational corporations, probably most of them unfortunately, have very mixed feelings about this transition towards a more integrated world economy. They do want free access to foreign markets, but most of them deeply resent the appearance of competitors on their home turf. And I think that the reason for that is also explained in this same article. It is that most multinational corporations still sell most of what they produce on their home market. And if I take our main competitors, General Electric, Siemens, GC Alstom in France, Mitsubishi in Japan, these are all companies strongly rooted on their home turf. And that's an advantage for them in these countries. But our advantage, our competitive advantage, is that when we go to Poland and pretend we're Polish, some Poles believe us. They will never believe it if General Electric tries to pretend to be Polish. And they believe it because Switzerland and Sweden is fading into the background, maybe not as fast as it should, but eventually it will fade, and we will have more and more companies rooted in other countries, more and more people rooted in other countries, and that, I believe, will be a very strong competitive advantage. But the fact that most corporations are not like that, I think, is one of the major reasons why protectionism is something which is advocated by governments, by companies, and in particular by multinational corporations, unfortunately. So this probably transitional situation does not alter the fact that we live in a world in which most business activities have become international, and thus, I repeat it again, dependent on open transborder channels. And all these companies I mentioned, which do not yet believe that their interest lies in this system, eventually should realize that their interest lies there. If you look at world trade, you see, and if you look at the figures also, you see that world trade is really a turbocharger for economic growth. You see, I now use terms out of my industry because we do produce turbochargers. We are the first producer of turbochargers in the world. Since the war, world trade growth rates have almost hovered about 20 to 25% above GNP growth rates. And when growth rates fell, GNP growth rates, well, the decrease of world trade growth rates were even steeper than the GNP decrease, which means that the turbocharger effect works both ways. There isn't a single developing country that has been able to achieve takeoff without linking itself to the growth engine, which is world trade. If you take the countries which have made it into the top 20 traders in the world over the last 10 years, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, South Korea, and China, all these countries have done it through opening themselves up to competition, linking themselves to this turbocharger effect of world trade. And in recent years, you know that several Latin American countries have radically opened up their borders and are now in the process of achieving takeoff. And even India and Brazil, which in '86, when the Uruguay round was started, literally tried to sabotage this launching of the Uruguay round and continued their sabotage actions through the first years of the Uruguay round, today are the most fervent adepts of a breakthrough in the Uruguay round. In fact, the irony is that those who launched the round now are blocking it, and those who were blocking it then now want to finish it. That tells you what has happened over the last 6 years. And when you look at the developed world, you can see that there is no country left, no region even, which can grow sufficiently, create jobs without trade. And the most spectacular example is certainly this country, the United States, which owes a quite substantial percentage of its now renewed growth to exports. And none of the exports of any industrialized country or region today can be sufficiently stimulated by just one importing country or region. There used to be a time where the US and Europe alternatively could play the role of locomotives. Those times are long gone. The world economy has grown. The relative size of even the largest national economies within OECD has shrunk. And the consequence is that the only locomotive left is world trade as a whole. You do not have any more individual locomotives. That's in fact good news, because that shows that we need a multilateral trading system, if only this good news were recognized. Now, the world trading system is our powerhouse at a time in which we desperately need economic growth to solve all the cataclysmic problems which lie ahead, mainly the ecological problems, the demographic explosions, all these problems we talk about and which lie in the future. There's no way we're going to solve them without growth, and for growth you need trade. So world trade is, in my opinion, the single most important answer to these problems, and also, and I'm now talking as a European, to the number one political problem we do have now in Europe, which is structural unemployment, the rise of structural unemployment. We have very high rates of unemployment now in Europe. Even Switzerland, which had 0% over the last decades, now is around 3, 4, 5%. Sweden is up 10%. Finland 17, 18%. Your unemployment rates now are really very low rates in comparison to ours. And we all know, particularly those in industry, that most of these jobs which are being laid off are not going to come back, because they are jobs which are certainly eliminated during a recession period under the title of recession management, but they produce higher productivity, and we are learning how to produce more and more with less and less people. So what it means is that when the pickup will come of our economies, those jobs will not necessarily come back, and it means that these rising rates, these increasing rates of unemployment are really of a structural nature. Structural unemployment will certainly stay with us for quite some time. It is the transitional byproduct of the progressive emergence of a new world, this world I mentioned before. But it would be a great mistake to accept this world as this structural unemployment as a disease without cure, as more and more people now do in Europe. The big discussion now in Europe is about how do you distribute this decreasing work among the people you have, rather than to talk about how do you create new jobs, which means that many people begin to believe that in industry, even in some service sectors, you can't create new jobs. That's a big mistake, in my opinion. And I think one of the major solutions to creating new jobs is opening up the new markets through this trade engine, is to make out of the 3/4 of the world population which are living in countries which are not yet markets, to make these countries into markets. I'm convinced that if we manage to do that, eventually we will create new jobs in our countries at the higher end of the innovation scale. So I'm convinced again that the world trading system and the opening up of these new markets, what we do at ABB in fact, is the solution, or one of the most important solutions to structural unemployment. At ABB, we had a decrease of orders last year in the OECD region of about 7%, an increase in the non-OECD countries of orders of over 100%, China, Latin America, and so on. That tells you where the new markets are, and that tells you how and what we need to do in order to create new jobs in our countries. Even though many of those jobs will happen in these new countries, some jobs will be created in our countries in engineering, as I said, at the high end of the innovation scale. Now, let me talk about the sad state of the world trading system after having, I hope, proven that world trade is a very important and dynamic growth engine, which we should not forget. I asked Chairman Greenspan yesterday afternoon whether he thought trade was important for growth in America, and he said yes, but in the very, very long term. And I must tell you, I just don't believe this. I believe it's a short-term cure, and I believe that we need to aggressively pursue it in order to find that growth we desperately need. Now, the sad state of the world economy, of the world trading system, because that's what I want to talk now about, is that free trade, as you know, is something everybody is in favor. In fact, it's a little bit like morality. Everybody is in favor of morality, everybody's in favor of religion, but very few people practice it. Very few people have morality, and everybody accuses the others not to have any morality, even though they believe they have some morality. That's exactly what happens with free trade. Everybody's in favor of it, nobody practices it, and that will be the case for a very long time, because we are in middle of this transition between these two worlds I described. I mean, this world which is still very much dominated by national thinking, by national companies, by regional thinking in some regions now, and this world moving towards more global economic integration. This transition may last for decades, maybe much longer. It will be characterized by ups and downs, by confrontations. The reality will never be a clear one. There will always be people pretending that free trade is something in the mind of people. The reality will always be a mixed one, but the important thing for us, I think, is to move always in the same direction, and this is a direction of more economic freedom. Strangely enough, it is at this historic time of great forward movement towards more political and economic freedom that we are facing the most serious protectionist backlash, I think, in a long time. The Iron Curtain has fallen. Communism and statism are out. The European single market, in spite of some setbacks, is closer than ever before. Latin America, parts of Asia, even of Africa, have gone through revolutionary movements of democratization and economic liberalization. Why is it that precisely at this moment we are debating and disagreeing more and more on the theory of the free market and reverting to dangerous and blatantly protectionist games? I think the reasons, I mean, there are many reasons, we could discuss them, but the reason is that increased freedom, and I think we've gone through an explosion of freedom over the last years, always carries the seed of its own destruction if it is not promoted and nurtured by rules, by well thought out rules of the game. Now, we do have rules, many rules, regional rules, world rules, the GATT rules. The problem with these rules is that either they have not caught up with a world which has become much more interdependent, or for the rules which are still very valid, like for instance the principle of most favored nation treatment, they are just being openly violated without punishment. And then I also believe that for too long we've had a tendency in the West to define the free market in terms of its antithesis. Communism, statism, we just pointed towards the East and said, look what happens if you don't practice a free economy. And now that the antithesis has disappeared, we suddenly discover that we don't agree on the thesis. And we are beginning more and more to discuss the thesis, not in terms of its antithesis, but in terms of the thesis. And I think this, paradoxically, the disappearance of the antithesis has a tendency to divide us. And we discover that everybody, like on morality, as I said before, has its own idea on what free enterprise, free trade means. Now, I very much believe that if we do want to keep that explosion of freedom going, and with it that powerful engine for sustainable growth which I described, I think we urgently need a new international consensus on rules. In some ways, I think we are very much in the same in a similar situation in which our fathers and grandfathers were after the Second World War, when they had to create a new system. The system then had been destroyed. They had to create a new system. Now we have to create a new system, not because the previous one has been destroyed, but because the world has changed. But I think we need to realize that you are the generation which will be called upon to create that new system. It turns out to be much more difficult than in the 40s to build these new rules. Why? Well, first of all, because there are many more players than there were then. All these players compete with each other and all have their own ideas of what the rules should be. Then, 40, 50 years ago, the United States could virtually dictate the rules. To our good fortune, these rules, which were dictated by the United States, were very far-sighted good rules. The GATT rules were terrific rules, have led to an explosion of trade, of growth, has permitted Europe to reconstruct, has led to the most spectacular trade-led cycle of economic growth the world had ever experienced before. This was all the more remarkable as the United States did not then need the rest of the world for its own domestic growth. Only a very small percentage, as you know, of US GNP growth was then linked to foreign trade. But the United States knew then that the rest of the world, and a broken Europe in particular, needed a strong US market to recover. The US thus created GATT not so much for economic reasons, but for security reasons. America acted according to a basic truth, which I think we should all rediscover today, which is that democracies only prosper and are only sustained in countries which have economic growth, which are going towards economic prosperity. Trade, thus, is very much a security tool, and the far-sighted attitude of Washington vis-à-vis Europe in the 40s is thus the same kind of attitude which is called for today by us, the Americans, the Europeans, and the Japanese, vis-à-vis Central and Eastern Europe in particular, and vis-à-vis the developing world. Some of these countries in '86, as I said before, objected to the launching of the round. It would really be a scandal of historic proportions if today those countries which have on their own, even without being forced by rules, espoused our free trade concepts, were let down if we turned their back on them by our own protectionist behavior. These countries practice these theories with more fervor than we have ever practiced them in the recent past, and I think it is really our responsibility now to give them the rules which they need to actually be able to go all the way towards recovery, and these are the rules I mentioned, which are mainly the GATT rules. Now, another difficulty for the increased difficulty, another reason for the increased difficulty of rulemaking today is the fact that in the current interdependent world, the name of the game is not anymore lowering import tariffs, lowering obstacles at the borders, but today the name of the game is integration, and integration means beginning to harmonize and to make compatible different microeconomic rules or microeconomic policies. It is not very useful to have access to a market, even if the tariff is zero, if you have to conform to all kinds of criteria of technical specifications and so on that do impede trade. So today, trade negotiations have to do with much more than classical trade obstacles. It has to do with, in fact, beginning the slow process of harmonizing microeconomic policies, microeconomic regulations. You can do this either through harmonization, this is rather difficult, or by just mutual recognition of systems. But that's the new kind of trade negotiations we have today. We do it on a regional basis, you in Nafta, we in Europe. The important thing is to push this kind of integration towards the world level, towards the level where the reality of our companies is. In other words, to begin to make GATT into an integration organization. And I think the Uruguay round is very much both the last round of the classical trade negotiations, we still discuss tariffs there, and the first integration round, where some microeconomic policies are beginning to be harmonized: intellectual property, investments, services, and also agriculture. So paradoxically, it has become more difficult to find a consensus than in the 40s. The further we advance in subjecting either to strictly national policies to international negotiation, the more resistance we find. It's almost like if we came close to a sound barrier and we have a very difficult time to break that sound barrier. Because, I mean, taking the example of my own country, agriculture used to be the absolutely sacrosanct, or the symbol of the national policy. I mean, agricultural policy is something you would never discuss with anybody else. That's the kind of thing which is purely national. Now agricultural policy is negotiated in GATT. That leads farmers into the streets. That is absolutely unacceptable for many people. So what we need today is statesmanship, I think, to break that sound barrier. We need more negotiation and less litigation. We need politicians. I will tell you, I believe that it is not so important for the Mickey Cantors and Leon Brittons of this world to be experienced trade negotiators, to understand all the pitfalls and intricacies and subtleties of trade negotiations. That's what the press wants us to believe. I think what we need in trade negotiations are statesmen, people like Bob Strauss. I mean, Bob Strauss never understood what the Tokyo Round was about. But what he understood is that a moment came where he had to cut a deal. And he sat in a room with a few other people and he cut a deal. And cutting a deal in trade is not a very dangerous thing, because as long as you err on the free trade side, as long as you take a risk on being too open, this is not a risk. You will win. The only danger is that you risk error on the protectionist side. So if you keep that in mind, and if you have statesmen in these negotiations who know when the moment has come to cut a deal, I think then you win. So my recipe for the Uruguay round would be send the negotiators home. You have thousands of people in Geneva in thousands of groups. It's the Babel Tower, negotiating on many subjects. These guys are lost, completely lost in the woods. Every negotiator is trying to prove his usefulness by pretending that in his negotiation there is a problem which is very difficult, very hard not to crack. That's what they tell their ministers, and you never get out of it. So send in the Bob Strausses, cut a deal, be a statesman, send the negotiators home, and then I think eventually we will be on the right track. I very much hope that this administration will do that. I very much hope that they will not reopen the negotiation, send their own technocrats who will make things worse. Now, the people we need are the people who see the big picture. And I think I'm going to leave my text because it is inhibiting me, I realize, and I need to talk more freely. We need people, the Bob Strauss is the statesman. Maybe Mickey Cantor will be a statesman. I'm not trying to say he isn't. But I think the people we need are big picture people. And we have less and less big picture people. If you look for big picture people, if you want to find statesmen today, you have to go to Latin America, Central Europe, some countries in Asia, in countries which have hit rock bottom and which have only one alternative or one choice to make, one decision to make, which is to do the right thing, which is to radically open up their borders. And I met two of these big picture people over the last weeks. One was Menem of Argentina. He's gone through a revolution in his own country. He's realized that the GATT rules need to be rules not which freeze competition at the level where it is today, which is insufficient, but which force governments, particularly governments in the industrialized countries, to accept more competition to open up. And the other guy I met last week was President Wałęsa of Poland, who 2 years ago was very attracted by Western Europe, and that's where he saw his future. Today he's realized that the Western Europeans, that's what he told me, were consumed by their own internal fights, did not realize what was happening east of them, And Wałęsa today is convinced that his future is east of Poland and not west of Poland. And that the priority of priorities for Europe is to stabilize the CIS. And if you want to stabilize the CIS, you need to begin to stabilize countries like Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and others, Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, and so on. And that if you have success stories in these countries, eventually these success stories will move east. That's, by the way, what we're trying to do at ABB. We have over 2 years built up around 20 companies in these countries. We have over 20,000 people in these countries, 8,000 in Poland, 9,000 in the Czech Republic. We're making money, not much, but we're in the black figures. We have trained the people there to become managers. They were already very good engineers. It works. And these guys are big picture people. They're revolutionary people. They have been for so long in the deep freeze that now that they are unfreezing, they want to do the right thing. They want to go through this free trade, free enterprise revolution, and they are much better students than our own managers. So that's what I mean by the big picture, by the revolutionary fervor we need, and I very much hope that this is what's going to happen. Just to tell you very briefly what are the things we need to do in trade to get on the other side of this sound barrier. We need to conclude the Uruguay round. We need to revive the rules which are good. The most favored nation clause is good. When I used to go to Korea as a Swiss trade negotiator and ask them to open up the insurance market for Switzerland, and they tell me, yes, we've done it for the US, but we're not going to do it for you. And then I said, well, when are you going to do it for us? And they said, well, we have 10 other countries or 15 other countries with which we're going to negotiate. You know, just queue up, and maybe in 5-10 years we're going to do it. Maybe we'll never do it for you. If we had the most favored nation clause in services, that wouldn't be a problem. We need to change some rules. For instance, the anti-dumping rules, the countervailing duty rules on subsidies need to be changed. Just to take one example, I mean, the American computer industry will not become competitive or remain competitive if the US authorities impose on this industry price cartels, which are very much sort of the mentality of the anti-dumping code. I would think you would just need to get rid of these rules. And when Menem says we need to force governments to open up and not to freeze competition where it is today, he has this in mind. What GATT negotiators are doing today is making the anti-dumping code and the countervailing duty code even more complicated to take into account every intricacy of today's complicated trade scene. What we should do is get rid of these codes, and then you would have the kind of shock and revolution you need. I'm going to skip some of it. How much time do I have left? Zero. I think I'm going to stop. I'm going to skip technology, environment. The next agenda for trade, the next round, the Clinton round, is going to be on technology, on environment, and also on energy, and maybe on development. It's all interlinked. But the reason for that is that these issues, which are becoming key issues and which are gaining tremendous political legitimacy, which are politically very sexy, much sexier than trade. Who cares in the street about free trade? You can't sell anybody free trade, but you can sell environmental protection. These goals are increasingly being pursued through ways and means which are harmful to trade. So what we need are rules which avoid harmfulness to trade. We need, for instance, to bring the trade negotiators and the environmental negotiators together so that ways are found in the ecological international negotiations not to harm trade. To give you one example, farmers have suddenly become Greens because farmers have discovered that the best way to sell protectionism is through ecology. You could say, we are the Greens in Switzerland, the farmers who hated the Greens up to now, because the Greens told them to put less fertilizer into their ground and to grow things less intensively. Suddenly the farmers have discovered that these were the people they needed, because through them they could sell protectionism. they could say, if we want to keep green pastures in Switzerland, we need to keep farmers. That's why you should be for protection. That's what I mean by being very careful that those who pursue these goals of ecology, of development, and so on, do not become those who kill free trade. The last thing I want to say is that, and I'm here in the United States, what I want to say is that there is a tremendous hope in Europe that this administration, and I say this in this school, which has given so many people to this new administration, that this administration is going to discover this new world and have the guts to establish new rules, establish a new system which fits that new world. I noticed that the campaign which led to Clinton's election led to many discussions also in Europe on what the recipes for renewed growth should be. Clinton has a few recipes. I hope they are the right ones. But this kind of fundamental discussion which took place in this country during the campaign, which took place in Little Rock, is the kind of fundamental discussion I think we need worldwide. So in that sense, I hope that this administration will bring the fundamental discussions further than the US borders into Europe, into the world. Secondly, President Clinton is a man of the new generation. He's the first US president who is younger than I, which is very, very good, I think. And he was born after the war. All European leaders were born before the war. And, well, with some exceptions, like the Swedish Prime Minister, but that's not so important. But if you take Major, Mitterrand, Kohl, all of them, they are people of the past. There's no question about it. If you talk to Kohl, he will see everything via the experience of the Second World War. And I think we now need people, and this is not a criticism of these people. These have done some right things. Now we need a completely new generation who realize we have a new world and who have the courage to break the sound barrier, to do courageous things like giving up anti-dumping codes and things like that, and which will build a new system. So what I want to end with is the sense that we in Europe, and I for one as a business leader, very much hope that you are going to be revolutionaries again in this country, and that you will bring the revolution to Europe, to Japan in particular, I think that's very important, and to some other countries. We, the multinational corporations, we, the business leaders, I think have to, and particularly those of us who are leading companies which are more multinational than others, who have recognized that we can only survive in a very multinational world, in a very integrated world. We have to help governments to understand this. And when I was in Washington yesterday and talked to several people at USTR, in the White House and so on, I had the feeling that for them trade was mainly a game of fixing some issues, breaking into some markets, maybe provoking some confrontations in order to get some leverage. But the rule-making was really very absent from their mind. I mean, they all said the Uruguay round is important and the Uruguay round needs to be finished, but I don't think they thought of it as something very revolutionary and something which could really make a difference. So I very much hope that this revolutionary spirit of the Clinton administration is going to also go into rulemaking, and that this administration is not going to be or remain purely national, but is going to become more and more international. I think it is good to relate international affairs to national affairs. You can't sell anything nationally if it's not national. I mean, you can't sell free trade if you can't prove that it's in a national interest to do it. I think it is good for Clinton to say that the Russian issue is really an American issue and so on, but you also need to be more international in the sense that you become a leader in this world which needs new leaders. I'm going to stop here, and hopefully there will be some questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. If we can, we have time for several questions. So why don't we start right there?
I just came back from a year in Yugoslavia and Italy. Went there to start my company, which we're not discussing.
Please speak loudly. It's very hard for people to hear you.
Vacation in Germany. What happened to the EC last year?
Well, what happened in EC is that the ERM, the exchange rate mechanism, exploded, which was maybe a good thing because I don't think it could have survived that much longer. We had the Maastricht debacle, which I don't think was a bad thing either, because I very much believe that the European recipes, those of Jean Monnet and some of his colleagues, need to be rethought. I mean, just to give you one example, now that Eastern Europe belongs to Europe, I believe that the theory according to which economic integration needs to come first before political integration has to be reversed. I think it is urgent to get Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and others immediately into the community and to the political umbrella, under the political umbrella of the community. That is the urgent thing to do. And then they can, be slowly, gradually brought into the other mechanisms. That's one thing which needs to be changed. Or why do all countries need to reach the same level of integration at the same time? That's another recipe which could be changed. I don't think that an Europe à deux ou trois vitesses would be necessarily a bad thing. So I think that the Maastricht discussion and probably the debacle of, I think Maastricht might be ratified, but I think whether it is ratified or not is not very important because I don't think Maastricht will ever become reality. I think that was good because I think it gives us Europeans now maybe a breathing space to rethink some of the recipes. But there too, you need to have the courage to have a fundamental discussion and to question some of the present setups and try to find new recipes.
Yes.
How about Nafta and other regional trade blocks?
Do people hear that?
Yeah,
question back
NAFTA. The question was about NAFTA. Regional integration has always good and bad sides. I mean, the good side is the trade creating effect. The bad side is the trade diversion effect. I mean, you know all this. But I very much believe that integration, I mean, the kind of integration I described, beginning to harmonize microeconomic policies is something which is much easier to do regionally than worldwide. And you can do it faster and deeper regionally. And so I think it is important that regional integration takes place. The important thing is that it goes in the same direction as the GATT integration. That these regional blocks, or block is the bad word, but that these regional groupings become sort of tugboats of the world integration. But NAFTA, APEC in Asia, and the EC are very different things. I think the EC integration, you must never forget, is a political integration. It aims at a political objective. And many Europeans will implicitly, even without admitting it, justify the fortress syndrome, which is a very dangerous syndrome, and the fortress policy with the political objective. They say the political objective is so overwhelmingly important that it doesn't matter if for some time we are a fortress. The American NAFTA integration, I think, is something a little bit different. I think it's a reaction to the fragmentation of the world economy, a reaction also to some extent to European integration. It's sort of the attitude, let's make sure that in a fragmenting world economy we keep at least our markets. And our market is Latin America. And the Asian groupings are again something different. I mean, the Asians are the only true world traders left. If you look at the trade structures of Asian countries, they trade more with the outside world than with their own world. And that's one of the elements which makes them more competitive, I believe. And they see, like the Americans, Europe having fortress tendencies. And so I think if you take APEC, which in fact includes the US, APEC is really an anti-EC fortress coalition. If it is that and remains that, I think it will be very useful. If APEC turns into a regional bloc, then I think it will be detrimental. I mean, Lester Thoreau, as you all know, and I talked to him this afternoon, he says GATT is dead. He says, let's forget about this world thing and let's just now go in the directions of bloc. He says the EC people are going to set the rules because that's the most important market into which everybody's going to try to get in. And so he sort of basically says one day the blocs will reinvent a trading system. I really think that's a very defeatist view, and I very much hope that we can avoid that.
I'd like to ask a question. I know there are more out there. You said very little about the former Soviet Union, although you did mention Central Europe. Certainly the attitude, views in the United States appear to be quite pessimistic about the future of the former Soviet Union, and I'd hesitate to say optimistic, but I would certainly say less pessimistic about Central Europe. I wonder if you might say something about your views of territory of the former Soviet Union.
I'm not very optimistic on the former Soviet Union, and I believe it is very, very important that we concentrate, that we focus on the former Soviet Union, which is in fact what President Clinton now is doing. I think the political situation, which you all know, is explosive. The power which is left in Moscow is eroding very rapidly. Russia is menaced of disintegration. The CIS is disintegrating. These are very, very dangerous and risky phenomena. If I look at it now from the economic point of view and from our point of view as a company, we very much believe that if the political disintegration, I mean, if the explosion of the former Soviet Union can be avoided, what we do in Central Europe, eventually we will be able to do it in the CIS countries. I mean, that's the Valenza view. We, in fact, believe that this is the wild, wild East, and you can make a lot of money in the wild, wild East. So we believe that we should be very, very active there. There are terrific technologies there in the defense-related sector, and also in some other sectors, in the optical sector, for instance. So we believe that we should move fast there, but the political uncertainty is huge. And so as business people, you shouldn't take too many risks, but you should be active nonetheless.
You probably know, it's probably a mutual friend, Bill Perry, who is an investment banker, is now the current Deputy Secretary of Defense, has described investment as the triumph of greed over fear. And thus far, with regard to Russia, he says, fear is winning, is the way he put it. Yes.
How can one enforce a sound world trade system when there is such incentive to defect the system, especially for the small countries?
What incentive are you thinking of?
If you don't play by the rules, usually you benefit by not doing it.
Yes.
For
No,
some countries.
you're absolutely right. I mean, the rules have no teeth. The panel system, the arbitration system in GATT is not a very effective system. But again, I mean, I keep coming back to this sound barrier image. You know, take again these countries like Argentina, Poland, and others. What have they done? They've done it all in one time. They've realized we are in a crisis. We're going to just open up, period. And as long as we do it incrementally, as long as we try to make a very complicated system already even more complicated, and that's what is happening in the Euro round. I mean, it's a nightmare. As long as we do that, I think you're right. I think the incentive to follow the rules, which are ambiguous, complicated, will not be very big. So the only thing which works is the shock treatment. But most of our leaders feel no reason for shock treatment. I don't think what President Clinton is doing is not a shock treatment, but it is maybe a shock compared to what Reagan or Bush did for the last 4 years. But we need to go much further than that. And the only way to do something, to do something which comes close to a shock treatment, is to do it under external pressure. Internal pressure can be sufficient, when your economy collapses. But if your economy doesn't collapse, like in some countries which I described, then the internal pressure will never be sufficient. So you need external pressure, and external pressure can only be created through new structures. I mean, through leaders getting together and deciding to do it. I mean, let me again take the example of Swiss agriculture. I mean, Switzerland has a very protectionist agriculture, the most protected agriculture in the world. Nobody in Switzerland, no politician in Switzerland can on his own open up Swiss agricultural policy. I mean, he will be kicked out of his office immediately. But if the Uruguay round succeeds and the Swiss have to do it, he will keep his job, because he will say, look, I did it, because the world trading system is what makes our industry, our services prosper. And I had to do it. And now we're going to try to find ways, under this new system to maybe keep part of an agriculture. So that's what I mean by creating external pressure through new structures.
We'll take two more, one here, and those will be the last two questions. Yes.
I understand why you consider it important to focus on external pressure and the need for greater leadership and better rules. But I wonder whether it's premature to give up on strengthening internal pressures. Because in the end, all the rules in the world, all the leadership in the world will work if the domestic political pressure is in favor of protectionism. And the forces are obviously the beneficiaries of free trade are the consumers and industries that benefit from free trade, and the losers are those industries which hurt from it. But so far, the equation is balanced in favor of protectionists. Is there some way, some creative way to change the equation such that we make it much clearer to the population that consumers actually do benefit from it?
Yeah.
Or some ways to encourage companies like ABB or the industries that have a large presence abroad so that they're as effective lobbyists in the trade debate as protectionists are. And that you can change that equation, I think you'll strengthen.
No, you're absolutely right. I think all those who perceive an interest in this direction need to get organized. And I'll tell you, there are very few business leaders who preach for free trade. And I think we should begin to organize business leadership in that direction. I think consumers need to be better organized, there's no question about it. And in order to create positive free trade lobbies. When I was a trade negotiator, I was under a lot of pressure from lobbies. They were all negative. I mean, it was the farming lobby, other protectionist lobbies, but there were practically no positive lobbies. So I think that's very much what we need to do. But rules. I realize every time I come to America, even though America is a country of rules and of law, in Washington, rules always come second in the trade system because you have many other weapons, which most other countries don't have. And again, the example of a Swiss trading negotiator going to Korea to try to get entrance for one of his industries is a typical example. There's no way we can do anything as a Swiss negotiator if we don't have rules. And so the only thing left, if the rules don't emerge, is to join a bloc, is to join the EC and to say, okay, now you defend us, with a crowbar. And that's why, blocs, Thoreau is right. Blocs are there already today. There are few who haven't joined them yet. You have ASEAN, you have 2 or 3 EFTA countries, you have Australia, Canada now less and less, you have a few Latin American countries. It's a coalition of about 20 countries. In fact, we had it in GATT. It's called the Groupe de la Paix, the peace group. This is the group of 20 countries which want rules. All the others, I think they can do without. And the main protagonists, the Japanese, the EC, and the Americans, I think they can do without. And the most important issue of the year go round will end up to be Super 301. If Clinton gets Super 301 to become law, Super 301 is a rule, a national American rule, which tells you that if somebody doesn't open his market, you can retaliate outside of multilateral rules. Super 301 means that the bilateral tool, in other words, the illegal or illegal tool, which is outside of GATT, always has precedence over the GATT tool. That kills GATT. So for me, that'll be the litmus test in trade of this administration. If this administration enacts 301, I think you can forget GATT.
Could you specify to which degree you think multinational companies such as ABB might be able, through cooperation, say strategic alliances, sort of circumvent problems of the trade negotiations and push the politicians eventually to say,
I think, in fact, the truth, I think, is that you can only be effective through countries. I mean, you can give big speeches like the one I just gave and say, look, I'm a multinational and we offer free trade, and that's not very effective. I think the effective way is to, in every country where you employ a lot of people, to put pressure on the government to do this. In the US, I think the most effective way to lobby for us is not so much through our lobbyists in Washington, but is through the congressmen in the districts where we have factories. We have 50 factories in the US, in I think about 40 states. So if in all these states and congressional districts we put pressure, and if our lobbyists become the congressmen, then we will eventually become effective, I think. I think that's the only way which works.
Let me close with 3 points. Point number 1 is I've been assured by Allison that as soon as we close formally, there are refreshments outside here, and if people would like to gather for a little while informally and ask a few questions, we can do that. Point number 2, there were several references to the number of Kennedy School faculty and alumni who have now joined the administration. I hope when this administration succeeds, you will give us all the credit, but if they fail, that you should think about how much worse it would have been had our people not been there. And finally, to thank David Dupuy for stimulating remarks and a wonderful set of questions and answers.
Goodbye. Great pleasure to meet you. Hi.